Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. So find a comfortable spot, adjust your volume, take a nice deep breath in, let it out slowly, and off we go. Before we begin tonight's podcast, I'd like to thank Jessie and Janine for becoming the latest members of our Patreon family. Thank you so much for your support. It helps make this podcast possible, and it's much appreciated. I'd also like to thank those of you who've checked in at buymeacoffee.com and, well, bought me a coffee, or in one case, a sassafras tea, which is fun to say. If you're interested in learning more about ways to support this podcast, you'll find links in the show description or at our website, www.boringbookspod.com. Now let's get to the reading. This evening, we're looking back a century to the days of World War I with one of its chief actors. We're reading The World Crisis by the Right Honorable Winston S. Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, 1911 to 1915, published in 1923 by the Macmillan Company of Canada Limited and Charles Scribner's Sons. Let's begin. Preface. From October 25, 1911 to May 28, 1915, I was, in the words of the Royal Letters Patent and Orders in Council, responsible to Crown and Parliament for all the business of the Admiralty. This period comprised the final stage in the preparation against a war with Germany. The mobilization and concentration of the fleet before the outbreak, the organization of the blockade, the gathering in 1914 of the imperial forces from all over the world, the clearance from the oceans of all the German cruisers and commerce destroyers, the reinforcement of the fleet by new construction in 1914 and 1915, the frustration and defeat of the first German submarine attack upon merchant shipping in 1915, and the initiation of the enterprise against the Dardanelles. It was marked before the war by a complete revision of British naval war plans, by the building of a fast division of battleships armed with 15-inch guns and driven by oil fuel, by the proposals rejected by Germany for a naval holiday, and by the largest supplies till then ever voted by Parliament for the British fleet. It was distinguished during the war for the victories of the Heligoland Bight, of the Falkland Islands and the Dogger Bank, and for the attempt to succor Antwerp. It was memorable for the disaster to the 3 cruisers off the Dutch coast, the loss of Admiral Craddock's squadron at Coronel, and the failure of the Navy to force the Dardanelles. Many accounts of these matters have been published both here and abroad. Most of the principal actors have unfolded their story. Lord Fisher, Lord Jellicoe, Lord French, Lord Kitchener's biographer, Lord Haig's staff, and many others of less importance have with the utmost fullness and freedom given their account of these and other wartime events, and of the controversies arising out of them. The German accounts are numerous and authoritative. Admirals von Tirpitz and Scheer have told their tales. Sir Julian Corbett, the official historian, has in 1,000 pages recorded the conduct of the naval war during the whole of my administration. 8 years have passed since I quitted the Admiralty. In all these circumstances, I feel it both my right and my duty to set forth the manner in which I endeavor to discharge my share in these hazardous responsibilities. In doing so, I have adhered to certain strict rules. I have made no important statement of fact relating to naval operations or Admiralty business on which I do not possess unimpeachable documentary proof. I have made or implied no criticism of any decision or action taken or neglected by others, unless I can prove that I had expressed the same opinion in writing before the event. Many of the accounts which I have mentioned above enjoy the great advantage of having been written some considerable time after the events with which they deal, when the results of schemes and operations set on foot in the early days of the war could be clearly seen, and when the ideas and impressions of 1914 and 1915 could be reviewed in the broad and certain experience and science of 1918 and after. There are no doubt obvious conveniences in this way of treating the subject. Actors in these great situations are able to dwell with certainty upon those of their opinions and directions which have effectively been vindicated by the subsequent course of the war, and they are not, on the other hand, obliged to disturb the public mind by dwelling on any errors of neglect or commission into which they may possibly have been betrayed. I have followed a different method. In every case where the interests of the state allow, I have printed the actual memoranda, directions, minutes, telegrams, or letters written by me at the time, irrespective of whether these documents have been vindicated or falsified by the march of history and of time. The only excisions of relevant matter from the documents have been made to avoid needlessly hurting the feelings of individuals or the pride of friendly nations. For such reasons, here and there, sentences have been softened or suppressed, but the whole story is recorded as it happened, by the actual counsels offered and orders given in the fierce turmoil of each day. The principal minutes by which Admiralty business was conducted embody in every case decisions for which, as the highest executive authority in the department, I was directly responsible, and are in all cases expressed in my own words. I am equally accountable, together with the First Sea Lord at the time, for the principal telegrams which moved fleets, squadrons, and individual ships, all of which, unless the contrary appears, bear my initials as their final sanction. The number of minutes and telegrams published in these volumes is, of course, only a fraction of the whole. Restricted space and the fear of wearying the reader have excluded much. But lest it should be thought that there have been any material suppressions, or that what is published does not truly represent what occurred, or the way things were done. I affirm my own willingness to see every document of Admiralty administration for which I am responsible made public, provided it is presented in its fair context. Sometimes a dozen or even a score of important decisions had to be taken in a single day. Complicated directions and recommendations were given in writing as fast as they could be dictated, and were acted upon without recall thereafter. Nothing of any consequence was done by me by word of mouth. A complete record therefore exists, both of executive and administrative action. If in the great number of decisions and orders which these pages recount, and which deal with so many violent and controversial affairs, mistakes can be found which led to mishap, the fault is mine. If, on the other hand, favorable results were achieved, that should be counted to some extent as an offset. Where the decision lay outside my powers and was taken contrary to my advice, I rest on the written record of my warning. Should it be objected that in any of these matters, many of them so highly technical, a landsman and layman could form no valuable opinion, I point to the documents themselves. They can be judged as they stand, but lest, on the other hand, it should be thought that I am seeking to claim credit which is not mine, it must be remembered that throughout this period I enjoyed the assistance, loyal, spontaneous, and unstinted, of the best brains of the Royal Navy, that every treasure and every branch of the Admiralty and the fleet was lavished upon my instruction, and that I had only to apply my own reason and instinct to the arguments of those who I believe stood in the foremost rank of the naval experts of the world. Taking a general view in after years of the transactions of this terrific epoch, I commend with some confidence the story as a whole to the judgment of my countrymen. It has long been the fashion to disparage the policy and actions of the ministers who bore the burden of power in the fateful years before the war, and who faced the extraordinary perils of its outbreak and opening phases. Abroad, in allied, in neutral, and above all in enemy states, their work is regarded with respect and even admiration. At home, criticism has been its only meed. I hope that this account may be agreeable to those, at least, who wish to think well of our country, of its naval service, of its governing institutions, of its political life and public men, and that they will feel that perhaps after all, Britain and her empire have not been so ill-guided through the great convulsions as it is customary to declare. Lastly, I must record my thanks to Vice Admiral Thomas Jackson and others who have aided me in the preparation and revision of this work, especially in its technical aspect, and to those who have given me permission to quote correspondence or conversations in which they were concerned. Winston S. Churchill, London, January 1923. Chapter 1. The Vials of Wrath, 1870 to 1904. It was the custom in the palmy days of Queen Victoria for statesmen to expatiate upon the glories of the British Empire and to rejoice in that protecting providence which had preserved us through so many dangers and brought us at length into a secure and prosperous age. Little did they know that the worst perils had still to be encountered, and that the greatest triumphs were yet to be won. Children are taught of the Great War against Napoleon as the culminating effort in the history of the British peoples, and they looked on Waterloo and Trafalgar as the supreme achievements of British arms by land and sea. These prodigious victories, eclipsing all that had gone before, seemed the fit and predestined ending to the long drama of our island race, which had advanced over 1,000 years from small and weak beginnings to a foremost position in the world. 3 separate times in 3 different centuries had the British people rescued Europe from a military domination. Thrice had the Low Countries been assailed, by Spain, by the French monarchy, by the French Empire. Thrice had British war and policy, often maintained single-handed, overthrown the aggressor. Always at the outset, the strength of the enemy had seemed overwhelming. Always the struggle had been prolonged through many years and across awful hazards. Always the victory had at last been won, and the last of all the victories had been the greatest of all, gained after the most ruinous struggle and over the most formidable foe. Surely that was the end of the tale, as it was so often the end of the book. History showed the rise, culmination, splendor, transition, and decline of states and empires. It seemed inconceivable that the same series of tremendous events, through which since the days of Queen Elizabeth we had 3 times made our way successfully, should be repeated a 4th time, and on an immeasurably larger scale. Yet that is what has happened, and what we lived to see. In the beginning of the 20th century, men were everywhere unconscious of the rate at which the world was growing. It required the convulsion of the war to awaken the nations to the knowledge of their strength. For a year after the war had begun, hardly anyone understood how terrific, how almost inexhaustible were the resources in force, in substance, in virtue, behind every one of the combatants. The vials of wrath were full, but so were the reservoirs of power. From the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and still more after 1870, the accumulation of wealth and health by every civilized community had been practically unchecked. Here and there, a retarding episode had occurred. The waves had recoiled after advancing, but the mounting tides still flowed. And when the dread signal of Armageddon was made, mankind was found to be many times stronger in valor, in endurance, in brains, in science, in apparatus, in organization, not only than it had ever been before, but than even its most audacious optimists had dared to dream. The Victorian age was the age of accumulation, not of a mere piling up of material wealth, but of the growth and gathering in every land of all those elements and factors which go to make up the power of states. Education spread itself over the broad surface of the millions. Science had opened the limitless treasure house of nature. Door after door had been unlocked. One dim, mysterious gallery after another had been lighted up, explored, made free for all. And every gallery entered gave access to at least two more. Every morning when the world woke up, some new machinery had started running. Every night while the world had supper, it was running still. It ran on while all men slept. And the advance of the collective mind was at a similar pace. Disraeli said of the very early years of the 19th century, "In those days, England was for the few, and for the very few." Every year of Queen Victoria's reign saw those limits broken and extended. Every year brought in new thousands of people in private stations who thought about their own country and its stories and its duties towards other countries, to the world, and to the future, and understood the greatness of the responsibilities of which they were the heirs. Every year diffused a wider measure of material comfort among the higher ranks of labor. Substantial progress was made in mitigating the hard lot of the mass. Their health improved, their lives and the lives of their children were brightened, their stature grew, their securities against some of their gravest misfortunes were multiplied, their numbers greatly increased. Thus, when the trumpet sounded, every class and rank had something to give to the need of the state. Some gave their science, and some their wealth. Some gave their business energy and drive, and some their wonderful personal prowess, and some their patient strength or patient weakness. But none gave more or gave more readily than the common man or woman who had nothing but a precarious week's wages between them and poverty, and owned little more than the slender equipment of a cottage, and the garments in which they stood upright. Their love and pride of country, their loyalty to the symbols with which they were familiar, their keen sense of right and wrong as they saw it, led them to outface and endure perils and ordeals the like of which men had not known on earth. But these developments, these virtues, were no monopoly of any one nation. In every free country, great or small, the spirit of patriotism and nationality grew steadily. And in every country, bond or free, the organization and structure into which men were fitted by the laws gathered and armed this sentiment. Far more than their vices, the virtues of nations ill-directed or misdirected by their rulers became the cause of their own undoing and of the general catastrophe. And these rulers in Germany, Austria, and Italy, in France, Russia, or Britain, how far were they to blame? Was there any man of real eminence and responsibility whose devil heart conceived and willed this awful thing? One rises from the study of the causes of the Great War with the prevailing sense of the defective control of individuals upon world fortunes. It has been well said, there is always more error than design in human affairs. The limited minds even of the ablest men, their disputed authority, the climate of opinion in which they dwell, their transient and partial contributions to the mighty problem, that problem itself so far beyond their compass, so vast in scale and detail, so changing in its aspect. All this must surely be considered before the complete condemnation of the vanquished or the complete acquittal of the victors can be pronounced. Events also got on to certain lines, and no one could get them off again. Germany clanked obstinately, recklessly, awkwardly towards the crater and dragged us all in with her. But fierce resentment dwelt in France, and in Russia there were wheels within wheels. Could we in England, perhaps by some effort, by some sacrifice of our material interests, by some compulsive gesture, at once of friendship and command, have reconciled France and Germany in time, and formed that grand association on which alone the peace and glory of Europe would be safe? I cannot tell. I only know that we tried our best to steer our country through the gathering dangers of the armed peace, without bringing her to war or others to war. And when these efforts failed, we drove through the tempest without bringing her to destruction. There is no need here to trace the ancient causes of quarrel between the Germans and the French, to catalogue the conflicts with which they have scarred the centuries, nor to appraise the balance of injury or of provocation on one side or the other. When, on the 18th of January, 1871, the triumph of the Germans was consolidated by the proclamation of the German Empire in the Palace of Versailles, a new volume of European history was opened. Europe, it was said, has lost a mistress and has gained a master. A new and mighty state had come into being, sustained by an overflowing population, equipped with science and learning, organized for war and crowned with victory. France, stripped of Alsace and Lorraine, beaten, impoverished, divided and alone, condemned to a decisive and increasing numerical inferiority, fell back to ponder in shade and isolation on her departed glories. But the chiefs of the German Empire were under no illusions as to the formidable character and implacable resolves of their prostrate antagonist. What we gained by arms in half a year, said Moltke, we must protect by arms for half a century, if it is not to be torn from us again. Bismarck, more prudent still, would never have taken Lorraine. Forced by military pressure to assume the double burden against his better judgment, he exhibited from the outset and in every act of his policy an extreme apprehension. Restrained by the opinion of the world and the decided attitude of Great Britain from striking down a reviving France in 1875, he devoted his whole power and genius to the construction of an elaborate system of alliances designed to secure the continued ascendancy of Germany and the maintenance of her conquests. He knew the quarrel with France was irreconcilable, except at a price which Germany would never consent to pay. He understood that the abiding enmity of a terrific people would be fixed on his new-built empire. Everything else must be subordinated to that central fact. Germany could afford no other antagonisms. In 1879, he formed an alliance with Austria. 4 years later, this was expanded into the Triple Alliance between Germany, Austria, and Italy. Romania was brought into this system by a secret alliance in 1883. Not only must there be insurance, there must be reinsurance. What he feared most was a counter-alliance between France and Russia, and none of these extending arrangements met this danger. His alliance with Austria, indeed, if left by itself, would naturally tend to draw France and Russia together. Could he not make a league of the three emperors, Germany, Austria, and Russia united? There at last was overwhelming strength and enduring safety. When in 1887, after 6 years, this supreme ideal of Bismarck was ruptured by the clash of Russian and Austrian interests in the Balkans, he turned, as the best means still open to him, to his reinsurance treaty with Russia. Germany, by this arrangement, secured herself against becoming the object of an aggressive combination by France and Russia. Russia, on the other hand, was reassured that the Austro-German alliance would not be used to undermine her position in the Balkans. All these cautious and sapient measures were designed with the object of enabling Germany to enjoy her victory in peace. The Bismarckian system, further, always included the principle of good relations with Great Britain. This was necessary, for it was well known that Italy would never willingly commit herself to anything that would bring her into war with Great Britain, and had, as the world now knows, required this fact to be specifically stated in the original and secret text of the Triple Alliance. To this alliance in its early years, Great Britain had been wholly favorable. Thus France was left to nurse her scars alone, and Germany, assured in her predominance on the continent, was able to take the fullest advantage of the immense industrial developments which characterized the close of the 19th century. The policy of Germany further encouraged France as a consolation to develop her colonial possessions in order to take her thoughts off Europe, and incidentally to promote a convenient rivalry and friction with Great Britain. This arrangement, under which Europe lived rigidly but peacefully for 20 years, and Germany waxed in power and splendor, was ended in 1890 with the fall of Bismarck. The Iron Chancellor was gone, and new forces began to assail the system he had maintained with consummate ability so long. There was a constant danger of conflagration in the Balkans and in the Near East through Turkish misgovernment. The rising tides of Pan-Slavism and the strong anti-German currents in Russia began to wash against the structure of the reinsurance treaty. Lastly, German ambitions grew with German prosperity. Not content with the hegemony of Europe, she sought a colonial domain. Already the greatest of military empires, she began increasingly to turn her thoughts to the sea. The young emperor, freed from Bismarck and finding in Count Caprivi and the lesser men who succeeded him complacent coadjutors, began gaily to dispense with the safeguards and precautions by which the safety of Germany had been buttressed. While the quarrel with France remained open and undying, the reinsurance treaty with Russia was dropped, and later on the naval rivalry with Britain was begun. These two somber decisions rolled forward slowly as the years unfolded. Their consequences became apparent in due season. In 1892, the event against which the whole policy of Bismarck had been directed came to pass. The dual alliance was signed between Russia and France. Although the effects were not immediately visible, the European situation was in fact transformed. Henceforward, for the undisputed but soberly exercised predominance of Germany, there was substituted a balance of power. Two vast combinations, each disposing of enormous military resources, dwelt together at first side by side, but gradually face to face. Although the groupings of the great powers had thus been altered sensibly to the disadvantage of Germany, there was in this alteration nothing that threatened her with war. The abiding spirit of France had never abandoned the dream of recovering the lost provinces, but the prevailing temper of the French nation was pacific, and all classes remained under the impression of the might of Germany and of the terrible consequences likely to result from war. Moreover, the French were never sure of Russia in a purely Franco-German quarrel. True, there was a treaty, but the treaty to become operative required aggression on the part of Germany. What constitutes aggression? At what point in a dispute between two heavily armed parties does one side or the other become the aggressor? At any rate, there was a wide field for discretionary action on the part of Russia. Of all these matters, she would be the judge, and she would be the judge at a moment when it might be said that the Russian people would be sent to die in millions over a quarrel between France and Germany, in which they had no direct interest. The word of the Tsar was indeed a great assurance, but Tsars who tried to lead their nations, however honorably, into unpopular wars might disappear. The policy of a great people, if hung too directly upon the person of a single individual, was liable to be changed by his disappearance. France, therefore, could never feel certain that if on any occasion she resisted German pressure and war resulted, Russia would march. Such was the ponderous balance which had succeeded the unquestioned ascendancy of Germany. Outside both systems rested England, secure in an overwhelming and as yet unchallenged naval supremacy. It was evident that the position of the British Empire received added importance from the fact that adhesion to either alliance would decide the predominance of strength. But Lord Salisbury showed no wish to exploit this favorable situation. He maintained steadily the traditional friendly attitude towards Germany, combined with a cool detachment from continental entanglements. It had been easy for Germany to lose touch with Russia, but the alienation of England was a far longer process. So many props and ties had successively to be demolished. British suspicions of Russia in Asia, the historic antagonism to France, memories of Blenheim, of Minden, and of Waterloo, the continued disputes with France in Egypt and in the colonial sphere, the intimate business connections between Germany and England, the relationship of the royal families. All these constituted a profound association between the British Empire and the leading state in that Triple Alliance. It was no part of British policy to obstruct the newborn colonial aspirations of Germany, and in more than one instance, as at Samoa, we actively assisted them. With a complete detachment from strategic considerations, Lord Salisbury exchanged Heligoland for Zanzibar. Still, even before the fall of Bismarck, the Germans did not seem pleasant diplomatic comrades. They appeared always to be seeking to enlist our aid and reminding us that they were our only friend. To emphasize this, they went even farther. They sought in minor ways to embroil us with France and Russia. Each year, the Wilhelmstrasse looked inquiringly to the court of St. James for some new service or concession which should keep Germany's diplomatic goodwill alive for a further period. Each year they made mischief for us with France and Russia, and pointed the moral of how unpopular Great Britain was, what powerful enemies she had, and how lucky she was to find a friend in Germany. Where would she be in the councils of Europe if German assistance were withdrawn, or if Germany threw her influence into the opposing combination? These manifestations, prolonged for nearly 20 years, produced very definite sensations of estrangement in the minds of the rising generation at the British Foreign Office. But none of these woes of diplomatists deflected the steady course of British policy. The colonial expansion of Germany was viewed with easy indifference by the British Empire. In spite of their rivalry in trade, there grew up a far more important commercial connection between Britain and Germany. In Europe, we were each other's best customers. Even the German Emperor's telegram to President Kruger on the Jameson raid in 1896, which we now know to have been no personal act but a decision of the German government, produced only a temporary ebullition of anger. All the German outburst of rage against England during the Boer War, and such attempts as were made to form a European coalition against us, did not prevent Mr. Chamberlain in 1901 from advocating an alliance with Germany, or the British Foreign Office from proposing in the same year to make the alliance between Britain and Japan into a triple alliance including Germany. During this period, we had at least as serious differences with France as with Germany, and sufficient naval superiority not to be seriously disquieted by either. We stood equally clear of the triple and of the dual alliance. We had no intention of being drawn into a continental quarrel. No effort by France to regain her lost provinces appealed to the British public or to any political party. The idea of a British army fighting in Europe amid the mighty hosts of the continent was by all dismissed as utterly absurd. Only a menace to the very life of the British nation would stir the British Empire from its placid and tolerant detachment from continental affairs. But that menace Germany was destined to supply. Among the great powers, said Moltke in his military testament, England necessarily requires a strong ally on the continent. She would not find one which corresponds better to all her interests than a united Germany that can never make claim to the command of the sea. From 1873 to 1900, the German Navy was avowedly not intended to provide for the possibility of a naval war against great naval powers. Now in 1900 came a fleet law of a very different kind. For the protection of trade and the colonies, declared the preamble of this document, there is only one thing that will suffice, namely a strong battle fleet. In order to protect German trade and commerce under existing conditions, only one thing will suffice, namely, Germany must possess a battle fleet of such a strength that even for the most powerful naval adversary, a war would involve such risks as to make that power's own supremacy doubtful. For this purpose, it is not absolutely necessary that the German fleet should be as strong as that of the greatest naval power. For as a rule, a great naval power will not be in a position to concentrate all of its forces against us. Even if it were successful in bringing against us a much superior force, the defeat of a strong German fleet would so considerably weaken the enemy that in spite of the victory that might be achieved, his own supremacy would no longer be assured by a fleet of sufficient strength. For the attainment of this object, that is, protection of our trade and colonies by assuring peace with honor, Germany requires, according to the strength of the great naval powers and with regard to our tactical formations, 2 double squadrons of first-class battleships, with the necessary attendant cruisers, torpedo boats, etc. Since the fleet law provides for only 2 squadrons, the construction of 3rd and 4th squadrons is proposed. 2 of these 4 squadrons will form one fleet. The tactical formation of the 2nd fleet should be similar to that of the 1st, as provided for in the fleet law. And again, in addition to the increase of the home fleet, an increase of the foreign service ships is also necessary. In order to estimate the importance of an increase in our foreign service ships, it must be realized that they represent the German Navy abroad, and that to them often falls the task of gathering fruits which have ripened as a result of the naval strength of the empire embodied in the home battle fleet. And again, if the necessity for so strong a fleet for Germany be recognized, it cannot be denied that the honor and welfare of the fatherland authoritatively demand that the home fleet be brought up to the requisite strength as soon as possible. The determination of the greatest military power on the continent to become at the same time at least the 2nd naval power was an event of first magnitude in world affairs. It would, if carried into full effect, undoubtedly reproduce those situations which at previous periods in history had proved of such awful significance to the islanders of Britain. Hitherto, all British naval arrangements had proceeded on the basis of the two-power standard, namely, an adequate superiority over the next two strongest powers, in those days France and Russia. The possible addition of a third European fleet, more powerful than either of these two, would profoundly affect the life of Britain. If Germany was going to create a navy avowedly measured against our own, we could not afford to remain in splendid isolation from the European systems. We must, in these circumstances, find a trustworthy friend. We found one in another island empire situated on the other side of the globe and also in danger. In 1901, the alliance was signed between Great Britain and Japan. Still less could we afford to have dangerous causes of quarrel open both with France and Russia. In 1902, the British government, under Mr. Balfour and Lord Lansdowne, definitively marked upon the policy of settling up our differences with France. Still, before either of these steps were taken, the hand was held out to Germany. She was invited to join with us in the alliance with Japan. She was invited to make a joint effort to solve the Moroccan problem. Both offers were declined. In 1904, the war between Russia and Japan broke out. Germany sympathized mainly with Russia. England stood ready to fulfill her treaty engagements with Japan, while at the same time cultivating good relations with France. In this posture, the powers awaited the result of the Far Eastern struggle. It brought a surprise to all but one. The military and naval overthrow of Russia by Japan and the internal convulsions of the Russian state produced profound changes in the European situation. Although German influence had leaned against Japan, she felt herself enormously strengthened by the Russian collapse. Her continental predominance was restored. Her self-assertion in every sphere became sensibly and immediately pronounced. France, on the other hand, weakened and once again, for the time being, isolated and in real danger, became increasingly anxious for an entente with England. England, whose statesmen with penetrating eye alone in Europe had truly measured the martial power of Japan, gained remarkably in strength and security. Japan, her new ally, was triumphant. France, her ancient enemy, sought her friendship. The German fleet was still only a building, and meanwhile all the British battleships in China seas could now be safely brought home. The settlement of outstanding differences between England and France proceeded, and at last in 1904 the Anglo-French agreement was signed. There were various clauses, but the essence of the compact was that the French desisted from opposition to British interests in Egypt, and Britain gave a general support to the French views about Morocco. This agreement was acclaimed by the conservative forces in England, among whom the idea of a German menace had already taken root. It was also hailed somewhat short-sightedly by liberal statesmen as a step to secure general peace by clearing away misunderstandings and differences with our traditional enemy. It was therefore almost universally welcomed. Only one profound observer raised his voice against it. "My mournful and supreme conviction," said Lord Rosebery, "is that this agreement is much more likely to lead to complications than to peace." This unwelcome comment was indignantly spurned from widely different standpoints by both British parties, and general censure fell upon its author. Still, England and all that she stood for had left her isolation, and had reappeared in Europe on the opposite side to Germany. For the first time since 1870, Germany had to take into consideration a power outside her system, which was in no way amenable to threats, and was not unable, if need be, to encounter her single-handed. The gesture which was to sweep Delcassé from power in 1905, the apparition in shining armor which was to quell Russia in 1908, could procure no such compliance from the independent island girt with her fleet and mistress of the seas. Up to this moment, the Triple Alliance had on the whole been stronger than France and Russia, although war against these two powers would have been a formidable undertaking for Germany, Austria, and Italy. Its ultimate issue did not seem doubtful. But if the weight of Britain were thrown into the adverse scale, and that of Italy withdrawn from the other, then for the first time since 1870, Germany could not feel certain that she was on the stronger side. Would she submit to it? Would the growing, bounding ambitions and assertions of the new German Empire consent to a situation in which, very politely no doubt, very gradually perhaps, but still very surely, the impression would be conveyed that her will was no longer the final law of Europe? If Germany and her emperor would accept the same sort of restraint that France, Russia, and England had long been accustomed to, and would live within her rights as an equal in a freer and easier world, all would be well. But would she? Would she tolerate the gathering under an independent standard of nations outside her system, strong enough to examine her claims only as the merits appealed to them, and to resist aggression without fear? The history of the next 10 years was to supply the answer. Side by side with these slowly marshalling and steadily arming antagonisms between the greatest powers, processes of degeneration were at work in weaker empires, almost equally dangerous to peace. Forces were alive in Turkey which threatened with destruction the old regime and its abuses on which Germany had chosen to lean. The Christian states of the Balkans, growing stronger year by year, awaited an opportunity to liberate their compatriots still writhing under Turkish misrule. The growth of national sentiment in every country created fierce strains and stresses in the uneasily knit and crumbling Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Balkan states saw also in this direction kinsmen to rescue, territory to recover, and unities to achieve. Italy watched with ardent eyes the decay of Turkey and the unrest of Austria. It was certain that from all these regions of the south and of the east there would come a succession of events deeply agitating both to Russia and to Germany. To create the unfavorable conditions for herself in which Germany afterwards brought about the war, many acts of supreme unwisdom on the part of her rulers were nevertheless still necessary. France must be kept in a state of continued apprehension. The Russian nation, not the Russian court alone, must be stung by some violent affront inflicted in their hour of weakness. The slow, deep, restrained antagonism of the British Empire must be roused by the continuous and repeated challenge to the sea power by which it lived. Then and then only could those conditions be created under which Germany, by an act of aggression, would bring into being against her a combination strong enough to resist and ultimately to overcome her might. There was still a long road to travel before the vials of wrath were full. For 10 years we were to journey anxiously along that road. It was for a time the fashion to write as if the British government during these 10 years were either entirely unconscious of the approaching danger, or had a load of secret matters and deep forebodings on their minds, hidden altogether from the thoughtless nation. In fact, however, neither of these alternatives, taken separately, was true, and there is a measure of truth in both of them taken together. The British government and the parliaments out of which it sprang did not believe in the approach of a great war, and were determined to prevent it. But at the same time, the sinister hypothesis was continually present in their thoughts, and was repeatedly brought to the attention of ministers by disquieting incidents and tendencies. During the whole of those 10 years, this duality and discordance were the keynote of British politics, and those whose duty it was to watch over the safety of the country lived simultaneously in 2 different worlds of thought. There was the actual visible world with its peaceful activities and cosmopolitan aims, and there was a hypothetical world, a world beneath the threshold, as it were, a world at one moment utterly fantastic, at the next seeming about to leap into reality, a world of monstrous shadows moving in convulsive combinations through vistas of fathomless catastrophe. And with that conclusion to Chapter 1, I think we'll end this evening's reading from The World Crisis by Winston Churchill. I think I learned more about the road to World War I in that hour than I ever did from studying anything at school. We'll be coming back to this one. If you'd like to read this fascinating work for yourself, you'll find a link to a free ebook version from Project Gutenberg in the show description. If you'd like to connect or suggest a boring book you'd like to hear read, you can contact me on our website, boringbookspod.com, or find me on Twitter at boringbookspod. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. Until our next boring book, good night.